David Ben Gurion. For many, the name likely rouses imagery of a bold revolutionary, an idealistic founder, and, well, an airport. Israel's first prime minister was a critical figure in the conception and realization of the nation. But the magnitude of his impact can only be matched by his complexities, his clashes, and his struggles. So here are the top nuances of David Ben Gurion's life and work that you might not have learned in history class. David Ben Gurion was known for his wide variety of ideas, a sort of Jewish Ben Franklin, a modern Leonardo da Vinci. But what many people don't realize is that many of his ideas were borrowed from other people. He just helped make them a reality. So founding a Jewish state, that idea was actually popularized by Theodor Herzl. Ben Gurion was passionate about the state, working as the leader of the pre-state militia known as the Hagana, negotiating with the British, and preparing for an inevitable clash with the surrounding Arab nations. But the idea of a Jewish state started gaining steam around 1896 when Ben Gurion was only 10. As a liberal socialist, Ben Gurion certainly identified with the early political and economic policies of the fledgling country, but he didn't invent these movements. Labor Zionism, the idea of cultivating a national identity through a connection with the land, that credit goes to these guys, among others. Okay, so what does Ben Gurion get credit for if the vast majority of his political accomplishments weren't started by him at all? Well, he may not have started them, but he sure did execute them. He took those dreams and turned them into actions. If Herzl was the quarterback, Ben Gurion was the wide receiver running into the end zone. The early Zionist movement was closely intertwined with the socialist spirit of the working class, a sort of political peanut butter and jelly, if you will. And Ben Gurion was at the forefront of it all. In 1921, Ben Gurion was elected Secretary General of the Histadrut, transforming an organization of workers in what was then Palestine into a unified labor force. He saw that unity as the backbone of Zionism. This also helped new immigrants acclimate into Israeli society, giving them work and a sense of purpose. Ben Gurion saw this synergy between the workers and the economy as essential to the country's development. Before the state was established, Jews in Palestine had three militias with very different military philosophies that often came into conflict: the Irgun, the Hagana, and Lehi. Ben Gurion led the Hagana, which was far more diplomatic than the others. He was so committed to defense and restraint with his militia that he insisted on no retaliation for Arab attacks against civilians and strictly emphasized a self-defense only attitude. Where the Irgun picked fights with the British, Ben Gurion's Hagana did all they could to maintain some sort of bond in hopes of preserving diplomacy. When Britain enacted the 1939 White Paper calling for a Jewish home within a fully Palestinian state, Ben Gurion had serious problems as the policy brought Jewish immigration practically to a halt at a time when it was essential. But despite the dilemma, he maintained diplomatic relations, encouraging the Jewish population to join the British Army in World War II. He was famously quoted as saying, "We shall fight in the war against Hitler as if there were no white paper, but we shall fight the white paper as if there were no war." Then there was the highly controversial, arguably aggressive Plan Dalet, which was very uncharacteristic of Ben Gurion. After the UN proposed a plan to partition the land into two separate states in 1947, the Jews of Palestine found themselves in a dire situation. Though they didn't get nearly as much land as they wanted, the leaders accepted it. The Arab leaders, on the other hand, rejected the plan completely, vowing to drive the Jews into the Mediterranean Sea. Violence increased, with thousands of fighters from nearby Arab nations infiltrating Palestine and eventually establishing a blockade, stopping supplies from reaching the 100,000 Jews in Jerusalem. In March 1948, under Ben Gurion's direction, the Hagana developed Plan Dalet. Not Plan A, not Plan B, not even Plan C, but the Hebrew equivalent of Plan D as a last resort. It was a controversial proposal to secure and fortify the borders of the Jewish sections of the newly partitioned land. Now, keep in mind the land allocated for the Jewish state was tiny and almost indefensible given its narrow borders. To help ensure its security, the Jewish forces decided to minimize the potential threat imposed by Arab villages in strategic locations. Plan Dalet gave Israel the ability to establish the strategic defensive borders it needed, but some historians also point to it as a factor that led to the Palestinian refugee issue that the world is still struggling with today. After declaring independence, Ben Gurion united the pre-state militias into a single defensive force, the IDF. But in doing so, he also instituted a draft that to this day sees most Jewish Israeli 18-year-olds serving for 2 to 3 years. With a national population of about 630,000 Jews at the time, a purely volunteer army would give Israel nowhere near enough manpower to stand up to even one attacking nation, let alone 5. With service as an obligation, every Israeli citizen would receive military training, in effect, creating a people's army. That would even include women between the ages of 18 and 28, as long as they didn't have children. Today, Israel is one of only 8 countries that include women in the draft. On the other hand, Ben Gurion allowed for the exemption of full-time students studying Torah from enlisting, a policy that continues to be hotly debated today. Still, by making it a people's army, Ben Gurion created the most powerful force to unify the citizens of the new country, despite differences in language, culture, and level of observance. The law of return is one of the most transformative pieces of Israeli legislation, opening the door of citizenship to any Jew, no matter race, denomination, or country of origin, was a hallmark of the tiny new nation. Ben Gurion was quite possibly the policy's biggest champion. He strongly believed that the influx of immigrants was essential to the new country's population and set immigration as a top priority. The Knesset, Israel's parliament, unanimously approved the law of return in 1950. When Arab countries expelled or encouraged their Jewish citizens to leave in retaliation for Israel declaring its independence, the law allowed for no less than 700,000 Yemenite, Iraqi, Moroccan, and other Mizrahi Jews to immigrate. Despite his enthusiasm for the law of return, though, Ben Gurion didn't have the greatest respect for this Mizrahi community and was concerned about their impact on Israeli culture. Meanwhile, he became frustrated when American Jewish communities didn't immediately pack up and move to Israel. Obviously, this didn't create many friends among American Zionists, but in the end, many Americans did come around. By the 1970s, American immigration to Israel reached a peak of 10,000 people annually. To this day, 2,000 to 3,000 American immigrants arrive every year. After the end of World War II, there was much discussion of whether Germany and other countries owed reparations for the Holocaust. Many survivors were vehemently opposed to reparations of any kind. To them, it implied that money could make up for the brutality, suffering, theft, and mass murder. But Ben Gurion recognized that there were realities to running a new vulnerable country. Shortages and rationing were rampant, and many survivors of the Nazi camps needed proper rehabilitation. Admitting Germany's guilt was a major concession, but it would also aid in West Germany's agenda to more quickly become accepted by the Western powers. Menachem Begin, another Israeli founder and Ben Gurion's rival, fervently opposed the agreement, having suffered the loss of his own parents in the Holocaust. Thousands of other survivors and children of survivors were similarly disgusted by the idea. Ben Gurion responded with a more pragmatic argument. He said, "I don't want to run after a German and spit in his face. I don't want to run after anybody. I want to sit here and build here." In September 1952, he accepted the controversial $1 billion in reparations, an amount that today would be close to $10 billion. On May 23, 1960, Ben Gurion declared proudly to the Knesset and the world that one of the worst Nazi war criminals, Adolf Eichmann, had been arrested and brought to Israel to stand trial. Now, you remember when Obama announced that we got bin Laden? Take that and multiply it by like a zillion. Knowing Argentina was a haven for ex-Nazis, Ben Gurion had arranged for Mossad agents to capture Eichmann and bring him to Israel to stand trial. By the way, how this happened was super cool, and you can either check out the movie Operation Finale or our video on the Eichmann trial. The trial wasn't just a forum to bring one of history's ruthless monsters to justice. It also opened the lid on the trauma that was the Holocaust. Before the trial, survivors had mostly kept quiet, rarely opening up about the horrors they had endured. But Eichmann's trial helped bring that truth out as thousands of survivors finally opened up, overcoming the stigmas and survivors' guilt so many of them had endured after being freed. On a deeper level, this trial was also a declaration that the Jewish people would no longer be bullied. United in their homeland, Israeli Jews were showing the world that they refused to be the helpless, tortured victims of the past. Eichmann's trial was Ben Gurion's way of establishing that once and for all. When Ben Gurion finally retired from politics in 1970, he settled down in the small and humble kibbutz Sde Boker in the Negev, or southern Israel. But one of the things he continued to advocate for in the final years of his life was developing the Negev desert. The former prime minister was insistent that one of the keys to Israel's future depended on the advancement of 4,700 square miles of desert, which is literally half of Israel's landmass. He felt it was a crucial test which would lead to the development of technologies such as desalination of salt water, solar and wind power, and understanding the vegetation of the arid climate that all would be essential for Israel's survival. And given that today technology is Israel's most developed industry, he just might have been onto something. David Ben Gurion died of complications from a stroke on December 1st, 1973, during the Yom Kippur War. Even though he had dedicated his life to Israel and for years worked through chaos as its head of state, he valued simplicity and lived by that philosophy in his retirement. You can actually visit the Ben Gurion home, a perfectly maintained freeze frame of how he lived in the Negev, a property with no more than a few rooms, a testament to his modesty and the simple life he loved. Thanks for watching. See you guys next one.